Starting us off with number 10 are Catherine and Curtis Fairchild Jones. In Melbourne, 1999, at 13 and 12 years old, Catherine and Curtis became the youngest people ever charged as adults for first-degree murder. The two shot their father's girlfriend Sonia and had plans to murder their father as well and another male relative for sexually molesting them. As soon as they had shot her, they realized what a huge mistake they'd made and they ran to their neighbor's house and said it was an accident. Even after evidence of abuse was found, no one did anything. No one believed the two were being abused and they were sent to jail. During their trial, they never brought up the abuse. Nothing about what they had endured was even mentioned. I mean, the man who was abusing them was convicted of sexually assaulting his girlfriend's daughter years prior. Why was this not brought up by their defense during their trial? I have no idea. Then the justice system failed them and they pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 18 years and probation for life. They were both released in 2015 at 29 and 30 years old. That's basically your whole prime part of life all spent in jail.
Number 9.
We have breaking teen coverage this evening. One of the brothers accused of murdering his 5 family members in Broken Arrow will spend the rest of his life in prison.
This right here is 16-year-old Michael Bever, who with his older brother Robert Bever killed their parents and 3 siblings during a murder spree. Is this real life right now? This is just so messed up. So now, living a life without his parents, he will see the inside of a prison cell for the rest of his life. Bever's 2 younger sisters, one being just 5 years old, was attacked in what was described as the worst single criminal event in the history of Broken Arrow City in Oklahoma. I mean, that is just so messed up. Bever was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder for his role in the killings. His lawyer did try to defend Michael Bever, saying that it was his older brother that planned and led the murder. His older brother he took a plea deal to his crimes and he was sentenced to life without parole. By pleading guilty, Michael's older brother Robert avoided the death penalty. Michael Bever was also sentenced. His lawyers couldn't get him off the hook to this traumatizing event. Number 8.
Now at the heart of all of today's proceedings was the issue of parole. Judge Edward Lukemeyer, who's presiding over the case, said at the outset that the issue is determining whether White fits in what he called the narrow subset of juveniles who deserve a life sentence without parole.
Well, for teenager Dakota White, he fit the narrow subset of juveniles who deserves a life sentence without parole, according to a judge. It seemed like Dakota didn't feel remorse for what he has done during a few recording phone calls of him bragging about his murder that he committed. There didn't seem like a chance of rehabilitating this teenager, so that's when he was given the harsh sentence. During the trial, it only took jurors about 15 minutes to come up with the deliberation of guilty. He was found guilty of stabbing and strangling Sam Poss to death. He was just 17 years old at the time of the murder. Number 7. We have 17 years old at the time of his crime, Joseph Spencer. He pleaded guilty to 3 first-degree murder charges in the deaths of his parents, and this is during Labor Day weekend. Joseph went on a killing spree. He was given 2 life sentences after he was tried as an adult. He will have to serve 2 life sentences concurrently, so one after another. And then when that's done, he has to serve his 3rd sentence. Spencer's dad was a UPS pilot, his mom was a science teacher, and I'm pretty sure this kid deserves to never see the light of day. Moving into number 6, we have 14-year-old Koalten Glenn Orr. And he was 14 at the time of his crime. He pleaded guilty for shooting and killing his father's fiancée, Laura Hendricks, and this took place in their home. He was sentenced to life in prison. Right after the murder took place, the teenager just walked into a police station and he confessed everything he has done. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Orr should be tried as an adult, so he was given life in prison. Right now there are appeals to try to have this teen tried as a juvenile, but that's most likely going to be denied. Orr's lawyers are trying to argue that sexual abuse that was done to him was the reason that drove him to commit these awful crimes, but that was quickly discredited. At least now he's gonna have a very long time to think about what he has done. Number 5.
Robert, we do begin with breaking news for our viewers in the West. We want to show you these pictures. Aerial shot of a middle school in Noblesville, Indiana. What has become a familiar scene. Students appear to be evacuating, running from their own school after reports that there has been a shooter there at Noblesville West Middle School.
Hearing about school shootings, it really upsets me, and I'm sure it upsets a lot of you guys. It seems way too common. Teens seem to be able to get their hands on guns like way too easily. There has has to be some sort of gun control laws that makes it harder for citizens of America to get guns, or just even ban them altogether. I know it's a huge debate. There hasn't been a mass shooting in Australia who has banned guns like 20 years ago, but I know it would be close to impossible to ban all guns in America. Going back to this story, we have a 13-year-old in which his identity, we actually don't know it. He is a minor, so his identity is protected under the law, in which I think is kind of stupid when you think about it. This teen was capable of committing murder. Why then we're trying to protect him? Well, he will remain in the state's juvenile detention system until he's 18 years old, and then he's going to be transferred to an adult prison where he's going to serve out the rest of his sentence. Because he showed no remorse for what he has done, it's likely the teen will never leave prison. Moving into number 4, we have Taylor Lane Gwaltney, who was just 19 years old when he committed the murder, and then he bragged about it. The murder took place in Colorado Springs, where the teen attacked a homeless man with a baseball bat. The homeless man was 55-year-old Doyle, who was beaten to death. Doyle was discovered earlier that morning, partially wrapped in a sleeping bag. He had been hit on the head at least 4 to 7 times. During the trial, a 7-man, 5-woman jury took just 2 hours to convict him. The hearing trial did take 3 weeks, so the jury had to listen in onto some pretty horrifying details about the crime. Well, the teen was convicted of the murder and he was sentenced to life in prison, and he showed absolutely no remorse for what he has done. He bragged to 16 people about the murder. Well, at least he is now living in the right place for the rest of his life. Next up, number 3, we have 7-year-old Gavon Ramsay, who was just found guilty of 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of aggravated burglary, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. Is this real life right now? What does that even mean, gross abuse of a corpse? Let's not think about it. Well, Ramsay killed 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, which is just so sickening. I mean, poor woman who lived so long only to be murdered. This kid is just sick.
A sentence tonight for the Medina County teenager who broke into the home of a 98-year-old woman, videotaped her sleeping before killing her and abusing her body.
Ramsay was given life in prison.
He left in chains, where he'll remain for life without parole, for the teenager who robbed a 98-year-old from reaching her dream of 100.
Moving into number 2.
The court, having duly considered your offenses, it is hereby ordered that you be committed to the Department of Youth Services until the age of 21, and furthermore committed to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction for the period of not less than 25 years.
So that was Philip Chism at the age of 14 years old. He was found guilty on many charges. He raped and killed his 24-year-old math teacher. Chism was ordered to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He started his sentence at a juvenile facility. Once he turns 21 years old, he's then going to be transferred to a maximum adult prison where he will serve out the rest of his sentence. Chism was found guilty on many charges. He was sentenced to 25 years for premeditated murder. Once that sentence is complete, he will then have to serve another sentence of 40 years for armed robbery. Once that sentence is complete, so that's about 65 years at this point, he's going to have another 40-year sentence for armed robbery. After he's done that, he's going to have another 40-year sentence. And it's not done yet. After that sentence, if this teen is still alive at the age of 79 years old, he's going to have to serve his last sentence of rape. So that is another 40 years. This teen will have to become the world's oldest person to be able to be released from prison at the age of 119 years old. Finally, number 1, we have 10-year-old Antonio Barbeau, who was charged with killing his great-grandmother in her Wisconsin home. He also had a friend help with the murder. Barbeau and his friend decided to try to steal money from 78-year-old Barbara Olson, but things took a turn, and a robbery, it turned into a murder scene. They took turns beating her with a hatchet and hammer.
Sentencing was held today for a teenager convicted in a crime that rattled Sheboygan County and fiercely divided a family. Antonio Barbeau learned he'll be a middle-aged man before he gets a chance at parole for killing his great-grandmother.
There doesn't seem to be much remorse, so I'm not sure if this kid will ever get out of prison. After Barbeau and his friend committed the murder, they actually decided to go out and enjoy some pizza. These are not behaviors of remorse. Barbeau's attorney was shocked when Barbeau was given a life sentence. He believes that kids, especially at the age of just 10 years old, shouldn't be given a life sentence. But you know what? If you're capable of doing the crime, then I think you should be old enough, and capable enough to do the time.
Our statutes, the way they're standing right now, 10-year-old facing life in prison, I don't understand that. They aren't adults, they're children.
And at number 10, we have George Perrot, who was just 17 years old when he was arrested, and soon after he was convicted of rape and an assault that took place back in 1987. Well, George spent 30 years in prison after it was deemed that he was actually wrongly convicted due to bogus FBI evidence.
He was convicted mainly on an FBI agent's testimony about a microscopic hair found in connection with the rape. But a judge found that evidence to be flawed and released Perrot on personal recognizance Wednesday.
This is why the justice system is just so messed up. A lot of times police officers or FBI agents are convinced, they're so convinced that this is the guy that committed the crime. So what they do is they do anything they can to get a conviction, to put this guy behind prison and to do it fast. Well, we have witnessed in the past them giving false statements, tampering with evidence, and a lot of times we have witnessed FBI agents and police officers get it wrong. They convicted the wrong person.
Did you ever lose hope after all those years?
No, absolutely. Of course, I've been in 30 years. A crime I didn't commit. Of course, I lost hope.
For people who may not have hope, what do you want them to know? He's got to pull out.
Don't give up. Don't give up. That's for sure. Don't give up.
Coming in at number 9 is ATIF, RAFAY and Sebastian Burns. Funnily enough, I knew about this case beforehand because it's a very good Netflix docuseries about different crimes, and it's called The Confession Tapes, and this was that first case it actually explored. Highly recommend. But anyway, in Bellevue back in 1994, ATIF and his best friend Sebastian came back to ATIF's family's house for the holidays. All was well until the boys came back from a long night out to discover ATIF's parents and sister brutally murdered and his house a complete mess. After their murder, ATIF inherited basically everything his parents had, buying a new car, living a new lifestyle, and seemingly not mourning the loss of his family at all. Police in both the US and Canada suspected the two boys of killing his family in order to get their money. They slandered them in the news like there was no tomorrow, branded them as murderers, and then using the Mr. Big technique to extract a confession from them. This technique is actually illegal in the US, but legal in Canada where it was done. It involves undercover cops gaining the suspect's trust by involving them in illegal activities and then getting them to confess. Even with multiple alibis and no physical evidence, the undercover cop kept probing Burns to confess and he would make it all go away. I'm assuming in the hopes of making his life go back to normal, Burns did confess, and later on so did ATIF, even though their stories were completely different. Both were found guilty in 2004 of a triple murder and were both sentenced to 3 life sentences each, even though they've been in prison for the past 20 years. At first I thought, how could anyone murder their parents, but after doing this video and seeing how many people actually did, I was like, wow, this is a thing. This actually happens. At number 8 is Joshua Smith. Now in February of 2012, 14-year-old Joshua broke into his stepfather Chico's room and stole his shotgun. Right after that, he started shooting things around the house, and Chico and his daughter were able to escape his rampage by breaking a window and climbing through. Joshua's mother, Tamiko Robertson, was sleeping on the sofa when he shot her around 12 to 14 times at close range. And why did he do this, you may be wondering? Because his mother was being a mother. That's right, Joshua started hanging out with the wrong crowd and wanted to join a gang, do drugs, pop pills. He started coming home at ridiculous hours, so Tamiko gave him a curfew and told him to stop hanging out with these people, and that's what triggered him. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and will be in jail for anywhere from 30 to 50 years. Filling our number 7 slot now is Evan Miller. Now Evan's life was hard enough. By the time he turned 14 in 2003, he'd been in and out of foster care due to his stepfather continuously beating him and his mother abusing drugs and alcohol. One day he was hanging out with his friends and his neighbor Cannon, who also happened to be one of his mum's drug dealers. After spending most of the night drinking and smoking weed, Evan and his friends attempted to rob Cannon after beating him. Evan beat him with a baseball bat and then set his trailer on fire, and he later died from his injuries and smoke inhalation. When brought to trial, his friend was offered life with a chance of parole if he testified against Evan, which obviously he did. In 2006, Evan was sentenced to life without parole, and now at 28 years old, he may have a chance at a retrial, but for now he's still very much in prison. Now at number 6 is Jacob P. Ind. Back in 1992, when Jacob was 15 years old, he killed his mum and his stepdad. After enduring years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, Jacob hired another older teen to help him murder his parents. Then, in the morning of December 17th, they went to their bedroom where they were fast asleep and attacked them for 5 whole minutes using various gruesome methods, stabbing them, spraying their faces with bear mace, and shooting them as well. He never testified during his first trial since his defense told him he would pack up and leave if he tried, so he was sentenced to life without parole. After spending 25 years in prison, he was finally granted a retrial and the right to testify back in August of 2018. And his retrial hasn't happened yet, so we don't know the conviction as of yet. Coming at number 5 is Diana ORTIZ. Diana was 18 years old when she moved to New York in 1983 to flee an abusive relationship, and that's where she eventually met her new boyfriend who was double her age. The man introduced her to drugs like heroin, LSD, and cocaine, and convinced that the only way to sustain both their habits was to stage a robbery. Note, not a murder, just a robbery. The plan was sorted. She would pose as a prostitute in a parking lot, wait for someone to approach her, and then her boyfriend and some friends would rob him. However, on the actual day, the victim that pulled up to her started fighting with the men, and a brawl ensued and he was eventually shot. While they all ran off in separate directions, what they had no clue about was that the customer was actually an off-duty police officer, and he actually died a few days later. Diana turned herself in and was convicted of felony murder and was sentenced to 17 years to life. And after 22.5 years in prison, she finally went on parole. Imagine 22.5 years in prison. I'm only 21 right now, and I feel like I lived a long life. That's my life and then some, all in prison. I can't even imagine that. At number 4 is QUANTEL Lotz. Now Lotz, like a lot of other kids on this list, had a troubled upbringing. His dad, mum, stepmom, uncles, aunts, basically everyone around him was addicted to cocaine, even getting high on it while he was still in the room at a very young age. He'd seen his uncle get shot multiple times because of drugs, and he himself was beaten on a regular basis. By 14, he used to have bouts of getting very angry, then crying uncontrollably, and then amnesia about what happened. In 1999, he was play fighting with his stepbrother Michael. It started off innocently, as it always does. Michael sent a blow dart his way, Lotz fired back with a toy bow and arrow, but then it turned very ugly and escalated into a proper fight. It ended with Lotz stabbing Michael a few times and then ultimately killing him. He literally doesn't remember the incident whatsoever, he just remembers being told the next day that his brother was dead and he was the reason. He was tried as an adult, not a juvenile, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even though at 14 the state of Missouri thinks you're too young to legally get married, leave school, donate blood, get a tattoo without parental approval, yet you're old enough to be tried as an adult and then put away in jail forever. Filling in on number 3 slot is John KATEHIS. Back in 2009, John was 16 at the time when he put up an ad on Craigslist offering sexual services in exchange for money, and the very popular ABC reporter George Weber replied to his ad. When they finally met up for this kinky hookup, if we can call it that, John claimed that George pulled a knife on him, and as self-defense he stabbed George 50 times. Mind you, George was bound and being choked when this happened, so I don't know how he could have even pulled a knife out to begin with. And if it was really self-defense, why 50 times? Surely someone's dead after maybe a few, or at least injured enough for you to escape the situation. During his hearings and his confession tapes, you can see him literally wink and smile throughout. At 18 years old, John was found guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life, and at 28 years old, he's still in prison today. Now at number 2 is Ashley Jones. Ashley was a problem child raised by problematic parents. Her stepdad used to sexually molest her, and her mum was a drug addict, so it appeared to be a blessing when her grandparents agreed to take in her and her sister. I don't know if they agreed to take her in or her parents kicked her out, since she stabbed both her dad and her pregnant mum a year beforehand. Luckily neither died. A year later, at 14 years old, she was disobeying her grandparents more and more, and she was dating a boy they didn't approve of. The couple hatched a plan, and she helped her boyfriend commit a series of murders. First, they killed her granddad, shooting him twice in the face and then stabbing him to death. Then her aunt, who they shot in her sleep, and then set them both on fire. They also attacked her grandmom, who also got burned on the face, stabbed in the chest and jaw and shot in the shoulder. Luckily, she survived, and she also tried to kill her own 10-year-old sister by stabbing her 14 times, but she also survived, thank God. Now at 24 years old, she's still in prison serving out her life sentence. And finally, at number 1 is ERIN CAFFEY. Way back in March of 2008, ERIN started dating a boy called Charlie Wilkinson. Story seems pretty kosher so far. After meeting Charlie, her parents felt like there was something off about him but didn't worry too much, but then ERIN started to change. Her interests changed, her demeanor changed, and her parents thought Charlie was a bad influence and wanted them to break up. So what do any desperate teenagers do in that situation? Hatch a plan. Charlie and his friend Wade went into ERIN's house while she waited in the car with Wade's girlfriend and shot ERIN's mother Penny whilst also nearly decapitating her with a katana. They then shot her youngest brother Matthew in the head, while James and his friend both took turns stabbing her other brother Tyler. As if that wasn't bad enough, they then set the house on fire and it was completely ruined. ERIN's father was also really badly injured. They shot him nearly 11 times whilst they killed Penny, but luckily he survived and was able to escape the house before it completely went up in flames. I mean, I don't know how lucky that is considering he survived his wife and kids and his remaining child is in jail, but it's still a good sign. Initially, no one suspected ERIN, but during Charlie and Wade's questionings, they both said that the murders were ERIN's idea. At 17 years old, ERIN pleaded guilty to murder, as did Charlie, and they were both given 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years.
Starting us off on this list, in at number 10, we have a teenager, Aaron Schmidt, who was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for murdering his 14-year-old neighbor, Elena Callahan. If for some reason Schmidt outlived his sentence, he will have an additional 5 years on his sentence. So that 5-year sentence will run consecutively after any other sentencing he might receive in the future for a possession charge. He will also have another 10 years of a sentence for theft, and again that's going to start after all of his other sentencing has been completed. After sentencing, it was actually appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court due to what in people's opinions were saying the sentence was cruel and an unusual punishment. But the judge rejected all the arguments in court and said he finds the evidence it was sufficient enough to find Schmidt guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of his crimes, and the punishment, it fit the crime. Alright, moving on this list, at number 9 we have 2 best friends, Ricky Jackson and Willie Bridgman, and they were arrested at the age of 16 years old for a murder that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. Harold Franks was the victim. Well, he was attacked with acid and he was shot twice with a .38 caliber gun. Both teenagers received the death penalty back in 1977, but it was later turned over to life imprisoned.
Yes. It was young Vernon's testimony that put Jackson on death row.
I could halfway accept my punishment if I was guilty, but, excuse me.
This story takes a huge turn because after spending 40 years behind bars, a judge released them, and the judge said they actually have the wrong people. Ricky and Willie were convicted after a false testimony that was given by a 12-year-old boy. These 2 friends didn't commit the crime, so for the past 40 years they were serving time for someone else's crime. Their lives has been taken away from them.
Words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do today? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know?
This guy missed out on school, getting his first job, finding a wife, having kids. Being a teenager, you get to experience a lot of things in life, and it is a very important and crucial time in someone's life. Number 8, we have Howard Christensen. He is a Chicago native who became the nation's longest serving prisoner before he finally completed his time. At the age of 17 years old, Howard committed murder and was given a life sentence without parole to 200 years in prison. But that was later overturned to a 64-year prison sentence, which is pretty much life in prison. While Howard actually outlived his prison sentence and was able to see the light of day. Well, just for a few years. Howard was 79 years old when he was finally released. Howard was only able to live 2 years as a free man before he passed away. Moving right along here, we have Bobby Bostic. And he comes onto our list at number 7. Bobby was just 16 years old when he was convicted of committing 17 crimes. Some of them include robbery and kidnapping. He fired a gun at 2 people. While he has been in prison for more than 20 years now, he is now in his 40s. Bobby on our list has one of the longest prison sentences. He was actually sentenced to 241 years. Many people believe that this was way too harsh for this crime. Murder was not committed, although there was near death. Back in 2010, the Supreme Court decided that their initial decision was unconstitutional and minors should have the opportunity to demonstrate maturity and rehabilitation. Even with that though, Bobby won't be eligible for parole until he's 112 years old. So if somehow he's able to outlive that, he has a chance of being a free man one day. Let's talk about a case I've paid close attention to. I've been very fascinated with it. Well, at number 6, let's talk about Brendan Dassey. Probably sounds familiar to you guys. I talk about him a whole lot. Well, he's a nephew of Stephen Avery, the guy from Making a Murder documentary. It's on Netflix.
How you doing, buddy?
Good.
Then they sat down with Brendan. Brendan's lawyers say investigators took advantage of him. Then just 16 years old and with a low IQ, manipulating him into making a false confession.
Brendan Dassey was just 16 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree sexual assault mutilation of a corpse. I believe Brendan Dassey is innocent and was framed. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possibility of parole in 2048. So that's when Brendan Dassey turns 58 years old. Right now he's 28 years old. Stephen Avery, his uncle, is also still in prison and he has served 18 years for a crime he never committed. He was released, but then he was sentenced again for a new crime, and I don't believe he committed that either. I think he was framed by the same people who convicted him wrongly the first time. So in total, Stephen Avery has been in prison for 30 years, and you know what, I can't wait for season 2 of Making a Murderer to be released on Netflix because I need answers. And actually at number 5, let's talk about Stephen Avery a little bit more. He was also a teenager when he was first in prison. Stephen was 18 years old when he was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, and this was back in 1985. Like I said, after 18 years and after DNA testing became more available, it was proven that Stephen Avery was actually the wrong guy and evidence was tampered with by local police. He was serving a 30-year sentence.
Back home, relatives waited patiently. After 18 years, the last few hours were the longest, until finally, the reunion.
Too long though, too long. Oh God, I love you, baby.
Stephen Avery was only free for a few years until he was convicted for a murder. This was back in 2007 and he was given a life imprisonment sentence.
They keep on trying to do something with me. They're trying to find ends. They don't believe none of us. You know, whatever we say, they just don't. We're all liars.
And next up, number 4, we have 65-year-old Wilbert Jones, who was just 19 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He served 46 years for a crime that he didn't even commit. His conviction was just recently overturned. Back in 1971, Jones was found guilty of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a nurse in Louisiana. Apparently, authorities withheld evidence that could have exonerated Jones decades ago. I think this man should have been rewarded millions of dollars, although money won't give his life back. The state of Louisiana took away this man's life. I would be super upset in this situation, but for some reason Jones, he's just thankful for being free.
No, I forgave. You know what I'm saying? I forgive. Because the Lord God knows who's in my life. I don't have no bit in my life. I got to go the rest of my life.
Number 3, we have James Robertson, who actually inspired a new documentary on Netflix called I Am a Killer. I'm currently watching it and it's really good. I don't know why I'm so interested in these topics, but they just fascinate me. And I swear, if I wasn't a YouTuber, I'd want to get into criminal psychology or work for Netflix and create these documentaries. James Robertson has had a whole life of crime. He was just 16 years old when he was sent to prison, but his crime started at a much younger age. He grew up with a family that are alcoholics and abusive. Robert is currently in prison for a crime he committed back in 1980, and it was for theft. He has been in prison for the past 37 years. For 20 of those years, James Robertson was left in solitary confinement because he was hard to deal with. So for 23 hours in the day, he's stuck in a very tiny dark room. He doesn't get much visitations, actually I don't think he's allowed them at all, barely no sunlight, and when he does get out of his cell for 1 hour a day, he's in another small cage outside. So James couldn't take this anymore, so he decided to kill his new cellmate, who was a pedophile, because he wanted to be placed on death row. I mean, is this real life right now? While on death row, the rules are different. You actually get a bed to sleep on, you actually get more food to eat, you get medical care. Also, James didn't want to be in prison while he was older because he said, well, he's just going to become an easy target for people to beat up. So he just wants to leave the world. So crazy, because he was just trying to fight for the death penalty, but it took him a long time to actually get it, this is a very unusual request. Number 2, we have Joseph Ligon, who was just 15 years old when he was convicted of murdering 2 people back in 1953. Well, it's been 63 years since he was first sentenced to prison. Currently, Joseph is about 80 years old, and he has spent most of his life in a Philadelphia prison. He actually made it into the news a few years ago because he was given the chance of parole, but he turned it down. Joseph rejected this deal out of principle. He claims that he didn't kill anyone. It's really sad, and you know what? There are thousands of innocent people who are in prison serving time for crimes they didn't commit, and Joseph is probably one of them. Why would he choose to continue to fight for his innocence even when he could be released from prison? So now he is the longest serving juvenile lifer in the world that has been documented. And finally, we have made it to number 1. We have Paul Giedel Jr. And he is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was released from prison, he was 86 years old, meaning he was in prison for 68 years. He was locked away in many different New York State prisons. Paul lived to see the day when he was actually released from prison. When Paul was paroled from prison, he didn't want to leave because that was the only life that he knew. He would probably go into shell shock because the world, it just changes so fast. He was in prison from 1911 to 1979. So let me tell you guys quickly what was invented during that time. So just to name a few, we had radio broadcasting, helicopters, microwaves, ovens, credit cards, widescreen cinemas, videotape recorders, video games, man went to space, computers were a new thing, and I mean all of those things. If you lived in prison, you probably never had any access to any of them. I don't even know if you get newspapers or if you read about it, a new computer, well, what is that? But if you get released into the new world, it can be very confusing.